August 1944. Somewhere in the northern Pacific, a cold wind moves across the deck of a Japanese transport as a detachment of Imperial Marines gathers in silence. Their uniforms hang loosely from weeks of ration cuts, and their faces are set in the stern discipline drilled into them since enlistment. Before them lies a sealed packet of orders. Escort a group of recently captured soldiers to an American-controlled island for exchange and intelligence processing. The Marines are tense. For years, they had been told what happened to prisoners of war in American hands. Stories passed through barracks, whispered in training halls, repeated by officers, painted a picture of starvation, humiliation, torture, and a slow, wasting death, a fate worse than battle, a fate that to them seemed inevitable for any man who surrendered. As the transport approaches the island, one Marine grips his rifle a little tighter, bracing for what he assumes he will witness: skeletal prisoners begging for water, diseased bodies lying in the sun, the remnants of an enemy too weak to stand. But the truth waiting beyond the shoreline will challenge everything he believes, and that realization invites us into the deeper story.
The Pacific War was shaped as much by ideology as by strategy. Behind every assault, every fortified ridge, and every moment of brutal close-quarters combat stood two opposing worldviews, neither fully understood by the other. And nowhere was this divide deeper than in the question of surrender and the fate of prisoners of war. For the Japanese military, especially elite formations like the Special Naval Landing Forces, their version of Marines, surrender was not merely forbidden, it was unthinkable. The roots of this belief stretched back through decades of military tradition, further reinforced by imperial education and the wartime press. Bushido, once a samurai code, had been reshaped into a national martial philosophy that elevated self-sacrifice to a virtue and condemned surrender as moral collapse. Soldiers were told from their first days in uniform that captivity meant shame, dishonor, and spiritual death. As Japan expanded across East Asia and the Pacific in 1941 to 1942, this worldview shaped the treatment of captured enemies. Planners assumed prisoners were men who had abandoned duty and thus deserved little attention in already strained supply chains. Food shortages at home, mounting naval losses, and the logistical fragility of Japan's island garrisons created harsh conditions for anyone living under the rising sun's war machine, soldier or prisoner alike. By contrast, Americans and other allied nations operated under a different framework. They adhered to the Geneva Convention of 1929, which established formal guidelines for the treatment of prisoners of war. While not always perfect in practice, these standards expected consistent nutrition, medical care, and humane conditions. The United States, drawing from its vast agricultural output and industrial strength, was uniquely capable of meeting these requirements even during the darkest phases of the war. Yet Japanese troops knew none of this. The Imperial General Staff tightly controlled information, portraying American forces as morally corrupt and culturally decadent. Propaganda insisted that Western soldiers mistreated captives, used them as forced labor, or starved them slowly in remote camps. Many Japanese Marines accepted these claims without question. They had no reason to expect otherwise. After all, their own army struggled to feed itself, let alone prisoners. The contrast became even sharper as the war dragged on. By 1943, Japan's logistical system strained under constant pressure. Allied submarines cut shipping lanes, destroying transports loaded with food and ammunition. Garrison commanders rationed rice by the handful. Disease spread through jungle outposts with little medicine available to stop it. In these circumstances, officers reminded their men again and again, captivity meant suffering. It was better to die with honor than to fall into enemy hands. This environment shaped the mindset of the Marines in our story. They had grown up in barracks where instructors spoke of American cruelty. They had seen their own comrades choose suicide rather than surrender. They had watched propaganda reels depicting foreign soldiers as brutes, and they had witnessed the conditions of Allied prisoners held under Japanese control, emaciated, exhausted, many reduced to barely more than survival instincts. So when orders arrived to escort a group of Japanese prisoners to an American-run facility for exchange, processing, or transfer, most Marines assumed they were heading toward a grim spectacle. They expected to bear witness to the consequences of surrender. Men starving in cages, beaten, humiliated, stripped of dignity. The Pacific, however, was full of surprises. American logistical superiority meant that even far-flung camps had access to foods Japanese soldiers had not seen in months, sometimes years. Meat, bread, coffee, vegetables, canned goods, even occasional treats like fruit or chocolate. Music drifted from radios. Chaplains visited regularly. Doctors examined prisoners with far more supplies than those available in many Japanese field hospitals. None of this aligned with the image Japanese troops had been shown, and that divergence between expectation and reality would soon reshape the thoughts of an entire Marine detachment.
While Japanese forces braced for the worst, the United States approached the treatment of prisoners of war from a vastly different angle, an angle shaped by law, abundance, and long-term strategy. To American commanders, POWs were not burdens. They were responsibilities, and in some cases, valuable sources of intelligence. Treating prisoners well was not merely moral or legal, it was practical. A prisoner who felt safe might share information willingly. One who feared death had no reason to speak. The United States had ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention in full. Food allotments, medical access, sanitation, and recreation were outlined clearly, and adherence was taken seriously. Even as American troops fought bitter jungle campaigns in Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and the Philippines, logistical planners ensured supply lines to POW facilities remained strong. When shortages struck, and they occasionally did, American policy required POW diets to mirror the rations of U.S. personnel stationed nearby. In practice, this meant that captured Japanese troops often ate better than the frontline Marines guarding them. American camps varied in scale and function. Some were temporary holding sites on newly secured islands like Saipan and Guam. Others were larger, organized compounds in Hawaii, Australia, or the mainland United States. But a common structure emerged: barracks arranged in neat rows, a mess hall with regular serving hours, a medical tent or small clinic, and recreation areas where the monotony of wartime confinement could be eased through supervised activities. Radios played music, projectors showed American films, comedies, newsreels, sometimes even baseball highlights. Chaplains offered spiritual counseling to prisoners of all backgrounds. To a Japanese soldier conditioned to expect abuse, these sights were almost surreal. But how did these conditions become known to Japanese forces still fighting in the field? Rumors flowed through the Pacific in unpredictable ways. Some came from intercepted broadcasts. Others came from Japanese soldiers who had been taken captive, treated, and later returned during small-scale exchanges or humanitarian transfers. Allied leaflets dropped over front lines sometimes included statements, true ones, about POW treatment, attempting to erode enemy morale. And in rare but documented moments, Japanese troops saw former comrades returned from American captivity in surprisingly good health. These glimpses, though brief, planted seeds of doubt. Still, disbelief remained strong. Japanese propaganda insisted such stories were falsified. Officers dismissed reports as psychological warfare. Marines in remote island garrisons had no opportunity to verify anything for themselves. In their world, surrender was dishonor, and captivity was suffering. No alternative was imaginable. This uncertainty sets the emotional tension for the moment of confrontation. By 1944, the war's tide had shifted dramatically. As American forces swept across the Central Pacific, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, the number of Japanese prisoners increased. Many were too wounded to resist, Others were unconscious when captured. Some were misidentified civilians or conscripts, but a growing fraction were soldiers who for the first time chose life over ritual death. U.S. forces, recognizing the intelligence value of these captives, prioritized humane treatment. The better a prisoner's recovery, the more coherent his debriefing, and the more coherent his debriefing, the more useful his information. On islands newly brought under American control, POW camps were often located near supply depots. This meant the hum of trucks, the smell of cooking food, and the lively noise of military routines floated into nearby air. A Japanese Marine walking past such a camp, expecting starvation, might instead hear laughter from a baseball game or music drifting through the evening. The psychological shock of such encounters was not immediate, but it was profound. If the enemy treated prisoners with dignity, what did that mean for everything a Japanese soldier had been taught? If captivity did not equate to torture or death, what did that imply for those who had taken their own lives rather than surrender?
Understanding why Japanese Marines were so shocked upon encountering American POW camps requires examining the multiple layers, cultural, logistical, psychological, and strategic, that shaped their expectations long before they reached the wire. Each angle reveals a different facet of the world they came from and the world they suddenly confronted, and together they form the backbone of this unexpected wartime revelation. For Japanese forces, the issue began with identity. From childhood through military service, they were immersed in a worldview shaped by a strict code emphasizing loyalty, self-sacrifice, and the moral duty to fight to the last breath. Training schools repeated the message relentlessly. Surrender was not only a personal failure, but a betrayal of the emperor. Captivity was synonymous with disgrace. A soldier who allowed himself to be taken alive had already forfeited honor and deserved no sympathy. This belief shaped how Japanese troops interpreted enemy behavior. Since they viewed surrender as a moral collapse, they assumed Western soldiers looked upon prisoners the same way. And because Japanese supply shortages often left their own POWs starving or overworked, they projected these conditions onto their enemies. If their own army struggled to feed its fighting men, how could the enemy possibly spare resources for prisoners? To Japanese Marines, the thought of POWs receiving proper food, medical care, or leisure bordered on fantasy. Yet the American system operated from an entirely different philosophical foundation. Rooted in the Geneva Convention, American military ethics framed prisoners not as moral failures, but as individuals placed under the care of the capturing power. This wasn't idealized generosity, it was structured responsibility. Even in tense forward areas, American guards were trained to enforce discipline while maintaining humane standards. Where Japanese ideology saw surrender as shameful, American doctrine viewed POW care as a test of military professionalism. But ideology alone didn't explain the profound difference. Logistics played an equally critical role. Japan entered the Pacific War with limited natural resources and vulnerable supply line. By 1943, American submarines had gutted Japan's merchant fleet, severing the arteries that fed island garrisons. Fuel, medicine, and food became scarce everywhere. Rations dwindled. Diseases spread in jungle outposts with little antibiotic support. Starvation wasn't a theoretical fear, it was daily life. Under these conditions, even frontline soldiers struggled to survive, and POW care, never prioritized in Japanese planning, became nearly impossible to sustain. Camps lacked food. Medicine was nearly non-existent. The environment was unforgiving, and prisoners often suffered the consequences of a wartime system stretched beyond its limits. America, in contrast, possessed an agricultural and industrial base unmatched by any nation in the conflict. Food production soared, even as millions of men mobilized. Supply networks spanning the Pacific delivered canned meat, vegetables, flour, fruit, coffee, and sugar to distant bases. Refrigerated cargo ships ensured steady delivery of fresh or preserved food. Medical supplies arrived in quantities Japan could only imagine. American POW camp regulations required prisoners to receive rations similar to local U.S. personnel, which means that, remarkably, Japanese prisoners often ate better than American Marines on the front line. These logistical realities, abundance versus scarcity, set the stage for the shock soon to unfold. The moment Japanese Marines first observed an American POW camp, the impact was immediate. They expected starvation and misery. Instead, they saw stability. Prisoners walked with strength, not weakness. Their uniforms were clean. Their barracks were organized and well lit. Meals were served on metal trays that carried more food than many Japanese soldiers had received in months. A bowl of stew or a slice of bread with butter wasn't just nourishment. It was evidence that their understanding of the enemy had been profoundly wrong. The reaction wasn't uniform. Some Japanese Marines stared in anger, believing it was deception. Others felt confusion, unable to reconcile this sight with years of indoctrination. And for many, the moment planted a dangerous seed: doubt. If American treatment of prisoners contradicted everything they had been told, what else had been misrepresented? If surrender did not guarantee torture or starvation, what did that mean for the countless Japanese soldiers who had chosen suicide on distant beaches and cliffs? The shock only deepened when Japanese Marines discovered that captivity involved not only adequate living conditions, but also recreation. Some camps had radios that played American music, swing tunes, sentimental ballads, or baseball broadcasts, drifting softly across the compound. Prisoners engaged in sports, often baseball, under supervision. Some evenings, projectors cast films onto makeshift screens, comedies, newsreels, or adventure serials. Laughter from a crowd of prisoners, men who, according to Japanese belief, should have been suffering the most, floated audibly across the wire. This stunned many Japanese observers. Not only were prisoners fed and healthy, they were entertained. They were treated as human beings, not as disgraced remnants of battle. Such moments struck deeply at the psychological foundation of Japanese military identity. Their entire worldview depended on the belief that surrender led to humiliation and death. Seeing the opposite forced a reevaluation of assumptions held since childhood. In a war defined by brutality, brutality was expected. That the enemy instead offered structure, cleanliness, nourishment, and even moments of joy fundamentally destabilized the Japanese Marines' understanding of what it meant to be captured. Yet beneath the humanitarian appearance lay another dimension: strategy. The Americans understood that humane treatment wasn't merely moral, it was tactically effective. A prisoner who felt safe, fed, and respected was far more likely to speak freely during interviews, not through coercion, but through trust. Many Japanese prisoners, surprised by their treatment, shared details about unit positions, supply shortages, defensive plans, or morale conditions. Even small comments, an offhand remark about a lack of fuel, an observation about troop fatigue, could be pieced together by American intelligence officers. This was a subtle battlefield, one fought not with rifles, but with empathy calibrated for strategic gain. Every well-treated prisoner was a potential source of information, and the consistent application of humane treatment across the Pacific made intelligence gathering far more effective. Japanese Marines rarely understood this dynamic at the moment, but American planners depended on it.
The moment of confrontation arrived quietly, without ceremony, on a warm Pacific afternoon. The sun hung high, casting sharp shadows across the packed earth as a detachment of Japanese Marines escorted a small group of prisoners toward an American-controlled installation slated for transfer and processing. They approached expecting the worst, expecting to find their countrymen broken, punished, and reduced to shadows of themselves. In their minds, the American camp beyond the trees was a place of torment, a living confirmation of everything they had been taught. What they found instead was a scene that defied belief. The perimeter fence came into view first. Not barbed coils, not deep trenches, not watchtowers lined with gun barrels, just a standard wire enclosure, with a few American guards standing casually, rifles slung, their posture relaxed rather than aggressive. Inside, a cluster of Japanese prisoners moved freely within designated walking paths. Some carried buckets of water. Others sat in the shade, talking quietly or playing simple games drawn in the dirt. From a distance, nothing resembled the image of starvation or abuse the Marines had been primed to expect. As they drew closer, details sharpened. The prisoners' clothes, simple fatigues provided by the Americans, were clean and intact. Their bodies showed no signs of emaciation. Their movements were steady, their faces alert. A few bore bandages, but even these were fresh, neat, and professionally applied. To the Marines escorting the new arrivals, the sight was almost disorienting. These were not the skeletal survivors of propaganda stories. They were not suffering beyond repair. They were, unmistakably, healthy. Then the smell reached them. Not decay, not sickness. Food. A mess tent near the center of the compound steamed with the scent of cooked meat, an aroma many Japanese soldiers had not encountered in months. A line of prisoners held metal trays, stepping forward one by one to receive ladles of stew, vegetables, and rice. Bread sat in baskets along the serving table. The water cans were full. The portions were generous. The escorting Marines paused, almost involuntarily. Their own stomachs tightened with hunger, sharpened by the contrast. They had survived on thin rations during their last operation, handfuls of rice, dried fish when available, foraged roots when desperate. Yet here, in the custody of the enemy, prisoners were eating meals their guards could scarcely imagine. One Marine stared with such intensity the American staff sergeant behind the serving line noticed. The sergeant offered a small, polite nod, neutral, professional, neither triumph nor mockery. The gesture felt impossibly out of place. The Marine looked away, unsure how to interpret the civility. A medical tent stood nearby with its flap open. Inside, two American medics examined a Japanese prisoner's arm wound, speaking through an interpreter. The instruments on the table were clean, gleaming silver against white cloth. Bottles of antiseptic and vials of medicine rested neatly in rows. A Japanese Marine watching from outside felt a tightening in his chest. Supplies like these were nearly unheard of in his own field unit, where wounded men often depended on torn fabric and prayer. Farther along the camp, another sound drifted through the air. Music. A radio perched on a wooden crate played a soft tune, an American song with steady rhythm and bright melody. It floated across the compound, settling over the prisoners like a gentle, baffling comfort. To Japanese troops accustomed to rigid silence and harsh discipline, the notion of music in a place of captivity was incomprehensible. The Marines were not sure where to look, not sure what to believe, not sure how to reconcile this with everything they had been told. As they continued escorting their prisoners deeper into the camp, some of the men they passed bowed politely, Japanese prisoners acknowledging their countrymen with respect, but without desperation. They did not cry out for help. They did not whisper warnings. They did not show signs of torment. Several even appeared embarrassed, having adjusted to a life that contradicted their comrades' expectations. One Marine, older than the rest, exhaled slowly. He had lost a brother earlier in the war, lost not in battle, but by suicide after his unit had been cornered on an island with no hope of evacuation. His brother, like many, had believed that surrender meant certain death. Looking at the prisoners before him, fed, treated, alive, a realization pierced him with sudden clarity. If his brother had known this, would he still be gone? The thought hit him with more force than any American bomb. As the Marines completed their escort duties and paused near the entrance gate, one of them turned to his squad leader, voice low, controlled, but carrying unmistakable strain. "Are we certain?" he began, stopping himself. He didn't finish the question. He didn't need to. They all felt it. This was the moment the emotional tension reached its highest point. This was the moment when training, propaganda, assumption, and reality collided so violently that the shock would echo for the rest of their lives. And as these Marines stood in stunned silence, their understanding of the war and of their enemy had changed forever. The Marines did not speak openly about what they had witnessed inside the American camp. Silence, after all, had been burned into them as a form of discipline, introspection held in the strict grip of military order.
but their expressions told a story none of them were prepared to confront. They gathered just outside the perimeter fence as the transfer concluded, each man staring through the wire at a reality he had never imagined possible. Behind them, the sea breeze rustled palm leaves. Before them, Japanese POWs finished their midday meal, setting down trays in an orderly fashion, wiping their hands with provided cloths, and returning to their barracks with calm efficiency. The camp moved with measured, predictable rhythm, more organized and humane than some frontline Japanese outposts. The most jarring element was how ordinary everything seemed. A prisoner sweeping the walkway, another adjusting a bandage under the guidance of a medic, a group gathering near a shaded table to write letters, supervised but unrestrained. Not degradation, not chaos, routine. For Marines conditioned to see captivity as annihilation, the simplicity of the scene was almost more crushing than brutality would have been. Brutality they could understand. Brutality fit the narrative. But this quiet structure, this unexpected dignity, was harder to bear. Word of what they had seen spread informally among the detachment. No one filed a report or made an official statement, but whispers moved through the ranks. During evening rest, men replayed the images in their minds. Steaming bowls of stew, clean medical tools, radios humming gentle American tunes. Many felt ashamed for feeling fascination, as though curiosity itself risked betraying their duty. Yet the thoughts refused to fade. This cognitive break, the widening gap between what they had been taught and what they had observed, began to alter something subtle within them. Not loyalty, not resolve, but certainty. For years, propaganda had painted America as a nation of cruelty and moral decay. Prisoners, according to every lesson they had received, were destined to suffer until death. Yet now the Marines had seen irrefutable proof that the enemy was not what they had been told. In fact, in some ways, the enemy displayed a level of compassion Japan struggled to maintain even for its own wounded. This realization grew heavier still when a group of American officers approached the Marines after the transfer. Their demeanor was formal but courteous, offering water and a place to rest before the return journey. One officer, through an interpreter, thanked the Japanese Marines for ensuring the safe arrival of the prisoners. The Marines bowed stiffly, uncertain how to interpret gratitude from a foe they had been trained to despise. The contrast between expectation and reality sharpened further as they prepared to depart. While waiting near the loading area, the Marines observed another set of POWs participating in an afternoon routine, a supervised baseball game. The crack of a bat echoed through the compound, followed by laughter and the playful tension of competition. Even American guards watched with amusement, occasionally exchanging light comments. A Japanese Marine standing near the fence felt his throat tighten. The sound of laughter, so out of place in war, struck him deeper than hunger or exhaustion. Baseball has long been popular in Japan as well. The familiarity of the game, performed inside a prison camp controlled by the enemy, created an emotional dissonance difficult to articulate. The game continued as the Marines boarded their truck. A prisoner hit a long grounder. Another sprinted toward a makeshift base. The sound of cheering followed them long after the engine rumbled to life. As the vehicle pulled away, the squad leader glanced at his men. They were quiet, their faces drawn not from fear, but from contemplation. What they had witnessed could not be dismissed as staged theatrics. There had been too much unguarded normalcy, too many small details impossible to fake. One Marine finally broke the silence. "We were wrong," he murmured, almost too softly to hear. The statement hung in the air, dangerous, unspoken, undeniable. The others did not respond, but they felt it too. If their beliefs about American brutality were false, then what else had been distorted? If surrender did not mean certain torture or starvation, then the sacrifices made by their comrades, the suicides, the last stands, the refusal to lay down arms, took on a new, tragic light. For the rest of the war, the Marines who witnessed that camp carried a quiet burden. They continued to fight when ordered, they continued to serve with discipline, but the certainty that once shaped their worldview had fractured. Some found themselves hesitating before condemning a comrade who surrendered. Others wondered if the Americans they fought were truly the monsters described in training manuals, and for at least a few, the memory of a baseball game inside an enemy camp, full of laughter, sunlight, and unexpected humanity, remained etched in their minds long after the guns fell silent. The war did not end quickly for the Marines who witnessed the American camp. They returned to their units, resumed their duties, and continued living under the harsh reality of shortages, disease, and unrelenting combat. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The image of well-fed prisoners receiving medical care, writing letters, laughing during a baseball game remained lodged in their thoughts, resurfacing in moments of exhaustion or quiet reflection. For the first time, many questioned whether everything they had been taught about the enemy was true. As the Pacific conflict intensified through 1944 and into 1945, more Japanese soldiers were captured than ever before. On Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Okinawa, and later in the Philippines, thousands surrendered rather than choose ritual suicide. American reports noted a steady increase in the number of soldiers who dropped their weapons and walked forward with hands raised, men who, only months earlier, would have fought to the death. Historians later connected this shift partly to stories filtering back through Japanese ranks, telling of prisoners who survived American captivity in unexpectedly humane conditions. For the Japanese high command, this was deeply troubling. Officers attempted to reinforce the old belief that surrender was worse than death, issuing strict orders demanding loyalty unto the final moment. But ideology was losing its grip. Soldiers trapped in caves or isolated pockets of resistance began weighing their options more realistically. The stories of American camps, rumors at first, then first-hand accounts from those who had been captured, challenged the indoctrination they had carried since youth. Meanwhile, inside the American camps themselves, life for Japanese POWs continued under regulated structure. They received regular meals, medical treatment, and opportunities to work for small wages within the camp system. Many spent their days repairing equipment, clearing brush, or assisting medical staff under supervision. Some learned English. Others participated in literacy programs or attended visits from Red Cross representatives. For men who had survived starvation-level rations or battlefield chaos, these routines offered stability that felt almost surreal. As the war neared its end, some Japanese POWs began worrying about something unexpected: how they would be treated once repatriated to Japan. Would their families accept them? Would society see them as weak or dishonored? These questions grew heavier when small groups of prisoners were exchanged or repatriated early due to wounds. Upon returning to Japan, many found their relatives stunned, not only that they were still alive, but that they appeared healthier than soldiers still on active duty. Reports from these returnees added fuel to quiet conversations across the home islands. Civilians whispered about the strange fact that men captured by the enemy had survived in better condition than those still fighting in the emperor's name. Though the government downplayed such stories, the contrast was undeniable. Japan's own population was now suffering from rationing and bombings, while American-held prisoners were receiving meals that some families had not seen in years. For many, the realization was painful. Families who had lost sons to battlefield suicides began to wonder whether those deaths had been necessary. Mothers who had encouraged loyalty unto death could not reconcile their grief with the sight of returning prisoners who had been fed, healed, and sent home alive. A crack formed in the emotional armor that wartime propaganda had built. The shift was not universal. Some communities shunned returning POWs, viewing them as tainted by surrender. Yet even among those who struggled to accept them, the undeniable reality remained. The enemy had not treated their sons as animals. The enemy had provided food, medicine, and dignity, perhaps more than Japan could have offered under its own deteriorating conditions. Across the Pacific, American officials documented these evolving perceptions with interest. The unexpectedly humane treatment of POWs had produced an unintended side effect. It laid a foundation of trust that would prove valuable when the war finally ended and Japan entered the complex period of Allied occupation. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the war's physical destruction was immediately visible. Cities burned, industries shattered, families dispersed. But beneath the ruins lay an equally profound emotional reckoning. The return of tens of thousands of Japanese POWs from American custody became one of the first major tests of this new post-war reality. Ships arrived at various ports, Kurihama, Maizuru, Hakata, carrying men in clean uniforms, thinner than before, but clearly healthy. Many walked with greater strength than soldiers returning from the front lines. Some carried personal letters or small items given to them by American guards. Others carried medical records documenting the treatments they had received abroad. And all of them carried memories that contradicted what their families and communities had long believed. The reception was mixed. Some families ran to greet their sons, tears streaming down their faces, relieved beyond measure simply to see them alive. Others hesitated, unsure how to respond to men whose survival implied, fairly or not, that they had surrendered. The stigma was embedded deeply. Surrender had been considered a stain that no amount of filial love could wash away. Yet as more returnees shared their experiences, a quiet shift occurred. Many spoke of regular meals, blanket provisions, humane guards, and access to medical care. They described the surprise of hearing music in captivity, of watching baseball games, of eating foods they had not tasted since childhood. They talked about American doctors stitching wounds with precision and American chaplains offering calm reassurance. They spoke of small acts of kindness that transcended the boundaries of war. The Japanese public, exhausted by devastation and scarcity, listened with a mixture of disbelief and reflection. How had the enemy, portrayed for years as ruthless, managed such treatment? How had Japan, a nation that prided itself on discipline and honor, failed to provide even basic rations to its own soldiers? These questions quietly circulated through homes, schools, and government halls. Post-war inquiries conducted by Japanese officials and scholars began to examine these disparities more openly. The picture that emerged was complex. Japan's logistical system had collapsed under wartime strain, unable to supply its own troops, let alone prisoners. But ideology had also played a role. The belief that surrender was dishonorable meant little thought had been given to POW welfare. Camps were not designed with sustainability in mind. Supplies were diverted elsewhere. Medical treatment was inconsistent at best, non-existent at worst. The United States, in contrast, had approached POW care from both legal and strategic standpoints. Compliance with the Geneva Convention signaled moral legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. Consistent treatment also generated reliable intelligence from prisoners who felt safe enough to speak. The humane system wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, structured, and aligned with broader military and political objectives. As occupation forces spread across Japan, this difference in approach helped set the tone for the rebuilding process. American authorities found many Japanese citizens surprisingly receptive to cooperation, partly because of stories that had already circulated about POW treatment. People who had family members held in American camps held less fear of retaliation or abuse. This atmosphere of grudging trust, though fragile, eased early tensions during the transition to peace. For the Japanese Marines who had personally witnessed American POW camps during the war, the aftermath was even more introspective. Some found themselves quietly advocating for better treatment of remaining Japanese internees still abroad. Others felt guilt when reflecting on how they had once viewed surrendering soldiers. A few carried a lifetime conflict between the values instilled in them during service and the truths they later observed firsthand. Historians studying these accounts emphasize that such moments of confrontation, where ideology collides with reality, often become the seeds of societal change. In Japan's case, the humane treatment of its POWs helped soften the psychological shock of defeat and fostered a more open acceptance of post-war reforms. It became part of the story Japan told itself as it rebuilt, a reminder that the world beyond its wartime worldview was larger, more complex,
and sometimes more compassionate than expected.
In the long shadow of the Pacific War, few moments carried as much quiet significance as the one where Japanese Marines looked across the wire of an American POW camp and saw not cruelty, but humanity. It was a moment that challenged years of indoctrination, shattered assumptions, and revealed a truth often obscured in wartime. An enemy is still human, even when propaganda insists otherwise. The sight of prisoners eating full meals, receiving medical care, and listening to music did more than surprise these Marines. It forced them to confront the fragility of belief. They had been raised to equate surrender with disgrace and captivity with suffering. Yet here, in the middle of a brutal conflict, they saw men like themselves living with dignity under the protection of those they had been taught to fear. The shock was not just logistical or cultural, it was emotional. It touched a place within them shaped by years of sacrifice, loss, and unquestioned loyalty. For Japan, the implications stretched far beyond the individual. The humane treatment of POWs did not end the war, but it softened the edges of defeat. It made the idea of occupation less terrifying. It allowed returning prisoners to become unexpected messengers of a broader truth, that compassion could exist even amidst destruction. And in the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt its society and reevaluated the values that had fueled its wartime decisions, these stories became part of a larger reflection on identity, morality, and the meaning of honor. War often magnifies the worst of human behavior. Yet moments like these remind us that conflict can also reveal humanity's better instincts, even when expressed quietly behind the fences of a remote island camp. The Japanese Marines who witnessed that scene carried its memory long after the war ended. In a world defined by violence, they had found a glimpse of something rarer, the power of kindness to reshape understanding and soften hardened assumptions. Their story leaves us with a simple, enduring truth. Sometimes the most profound victories in war are not won on the battlefield, but in the hearts of those who see their enemy with new eyes.